Assalamu alaikum, students. This is lecture number 20. Today I will tell you about the new classical period. Remember Dr. Johnson, who we have studied? He or who we are studying, he belongs to this particular age. Dr. Johnson, it is said about the new classical period. There are different names of this period. New classical period, Augustan age, pseudo classical age. These are different names which are given to this particular period, and this is probably the longest period in the history of English literature. And it is roughly said that it begins with it begins with Dryden, John Dryden, and ends with the death of Dr. Johnson. So today we will talk about the chief characteristics of this period. I will tell you about the chief characteristics of this period. The new classical period or age. So, chief characteristics of the new classical age. As I told you that in the history of English literature, the period of over or more than 100 years from 1660 means after Restoration to 1780, and in some books 70 or 1780 is variously called to Augustan age, or the classical age, or the pseudo classical age, or the age of new classicism. It is called the Augustan age because the writers of this period, they thought that their age was an age of brilliant writers, like the age of King Augustus of ancient Rome. They suppose that their poetry had the same qualities as the poetry of ancient Greece and Rome, and they were really and correctly following the rules laid down by the ancients. This is what they supposed. But in fact, or in reality, the poetry of the period does not have the qualities of classical poetry, nor do the poets really follow the rules of the ancients. And if we say that the so-called rules are much misunderstood and misinterpreted, so this will not be wrong. So in the classical poetry, a harmonious balance was maintained between poetic expression and poetic substance. But in the poetry of this age, too much attention is given to expression at the cost of substance. So it means that substance was not given importance, but expressions were given more importance. Therefore, the age is not really classical, and it is rightly called pseudo classical or new classical age. Pseudo classical age is the result of a number of factors working together. There are a number of factors which working together. So reaction against the fantastic excesses of the metaphysicals, influence of French writers and critics, and the study of the ancients and great admiration for them, and the scientific rationalism of the age. These all contributed to the growth of pseudo classicism or pseudo new classical age. If you talk about the chief characteristics of this particular age, we can find the first very important element is formal perfection. Perfection, you can say in simple words, perfection. This is the age that has been characterized by formal perfection. Why? Because the poets were caring more for the perfection of their language than for their subject matter. They were paying more attention to the perfection of their language rather than subject matter. Subject matter was not important for them. They revise and re-revise what they write and try to say what they have to say in the fewest possible as well as the best possible words. So these things happen when we try to bring perfection, or when we try our best to bring perfection in our style or writing or whatever we are doing. The poet must be correct above everything else. This is their what should I say, this is their concept, that the poet must be correct above everything else. Every word which is considered coarse, vulgar and low is carefully avoided, and in this way, loftiness and grandeur are imparted to the language of poetry. Remember, loftiness and grandeur; these things are imparted to the language of poetry. So every word which they considered coarse, vulgar, and low, they carefully avoided. And that is why the result, when we study neoclassical era, so we find that the result of all these things is in the growth of an artificial poetic diction in the language of poetry is cut off from the language of everyday use. The language of poetry is something that is cut from the language of everyday use. This is something that we can find with romantic writers, that they use the language of everyday life and they did not have artificial poetic diction. So this was the first. This is the first characteristic of new classical era formal perfection. Then you will find deficient in if emotion. New classical poetry is deficient in emotion and imagination. Now, the poetry is deficient in emotion and imagination. In new classical poetry, there is much reasoning and argumentation, and therefore this has a deadening effect. This has a deadening effect on imagination and emotion, which are the true substance of poetry. Remember, deadening effect means which kills the effects, which kills the effect on imagination and emotion. And these are, according to many critics, the true substance of poetry. The poetry of the period has a hard intellectual tone. In this age of prose and reason, remember this is the age of prose and reason, even poetry has grown prosaic. अगर आप पोइट्री को पढ़ेंगे तो वो भी प्रोजाइक होगी, प्रोज जैसे लगने लगी. Then the third thing, poetry of city. It is exclusively it is exclusively a poetry. It is exclusively the poetry of city. It means this kind of poetry deals with the life of the court and the courtly circles, like with the life of the fashionable upper classes of the city of London. It is as artificial and trivial as the artificial and frivolous life it deals with. We have a very good example of such kind of poetry when we read the poetry of Alexander Pope. The Rape of the Lock is a very good example in which we can see how city life has been depicted and how trivial things are being given importance. It has no love for the humble humanity and for the lower creatures. So in this particular age, poetry is confined, or poetry was confined to the city life. Only city life was given importance. City life was chosen as a subject for poetry. Then we have the other point that there was there is no love for the beauties of nature. When we study this age or the work of this age, we find that there is no love for the beauties of nature. You'll find beauties of nature everywhere, but unfortunately in this kind of literature you'll find no love for such things. The poets rarely take us out of the suffocating atmosphere of the city into the refreshing atmosphere of the countryside. Rarely takes out. Means once in a blue moon, you'll find the mention of beauties of nature. Otherwise, you'll find no beauties of nature. Dryden has no love at all for external nature. When in the hands, it is said that in the hands of Pope Alexander Pope, even nature becomes unnatural and very artificial.
बना रहा है।
The next point is imitation of the ancients' general rule. Now, when we study the works of this age, especially poetry, we find it is the in this kind of literature, imitation of the ancient has become the general rule. The the poets try to write according to certain rules. They had certain rules, and they had means they started following certain rules, and they supposed to have been laid down by the ancient writers. They look down upon the great English poets with indifference, even with contempt. They insist that the rules laid down by the ancient writers and interpreted by the French critics of the day should be followed correctly and strictly. जिस उनका ये कहना था कि ये जो रूल्स एंशियंट राइटर्स ने बनाए थे और उनको फ्रेंच राइटर्स और क्रिटिक्स ने जो है उनकी तशरीह की थी, उनको सही मानों में उन पर सख्ती से अमल होना चाहिए. This writing by rules results in the repression of emotion and imagination, and in correctness and elegance of expression. Again, this writing by rules results in the repression of emotion, इससे emotion जो थे वो दब गए, and imagination, and in correctness and elegance of expression, और correctness और elegance of expression जो है वो सामने आया. And that is why instead instead of spontaneity, we get an artificial poetry that is correct in its diction and versification. Indeed, if we see very thoroughly, we can find correctness is regarded or considered to be the supreme virtue of a poet. Correctness, correctness again, correctness is regarded or considered to be the supreme virtue of a poet. यानी कि किसी भी शायर का जो है सबसे बड़ी जो खासियत थी वो करेक्टनेस ही को समझा जाता था और समझा जाने लगा. It should also be noted that of the observance of the rules. Remember, observance of the rules in, is flexible in the beginning. They observe the rules with flexibility in the beginning, but the rules become or it grow more and more rigid with the passage of time. With the passage of time, the rules became very strict. And that is why Dryden is flexible in his diction and versification. On the other hand, Pope is much more rigid. In fact, Alexander Pope follows the rules more strictly, and then Dryden did, or then he does. तो रूल्स जो थे उनको बहुत सख्ती से उनसे अमल पैरा हुए, और रूल्स जो हैं उनके तहत ही ये अपनी पोइट्री और जो भी इनका वर्क है लिटरेचर का वो उसको करते. Reflection and philosophical comment on man and life. This is another very important characteristic of this age. So, in this poetry, we can find much reflection and philosophical comment on man and life. Generally, their moralizing is much superficial. The way they moralize it is very superficial, lacks entirely in depth and originality. You will not find depth and originality in it. The poets moralize on life, but they rarely have anything new or significant to say. Means you can say once in a blue moon they have this thing, otherwise they have nothing new or significant to say. And for this reason, Hudson remarks that the poetry of the Augustan age or this age is in the main the product of the intelligence playing upon the surface of life. Again, the product of the intelligence playing upon the surface of life. Then another point is poetry of this age was written only in 1 meter. So, with the few exceptions, the poetry of this age is written in one only 1 meter, and that meter is heroic couplet. The new classical uh, couplet is a close couplet in which the sentence ends with each couplet rather than the run on couplet, in which the sentence runs on from one couplet to another. And this kind of couplet was perfected by the poets Edmund Waller and John Denham. Dryden praised these poets highly for their handling of the couplet. So when we study this, the writers of this age, especially poets, we can find or we see very clearly that they have used heroic couplet and they were confined to only 1 meter, and that is heroic couplet. Again, we have the example of Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, in which we see the use of heroic couplet, and then there are works of other writers like John, Dryden, and other writers' work we can also find. Another very important characteristic of this particular age is that this is the age of satire. It is called a great age of satire. And what is satire? We have already discussed it. Satire is a way of criticizing uh, a person, place, organization in which humor can be used, in which, you know, there are different other stylistic devices which are used. So it is a great age of satire, and it is said that satire was written in the form of poetry and prose both. In the form of poetry, again, we see Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, we see Dryden's work, and in the form of prose, we see Jonathan Swift's work, Gulliver's Travels. In this age, great satiric, argumentative, argumentative, and reflective poetry was written. There is hardly any lyric and sonnet that is worth mentioning and that which belongs to this period. It is a great age of satire, and satire was written in the form of poetry and prose both. So, as I told you that in the history of English literature, the period that covers more than 100 years almost is called the New Classical Age or Augustan Age or the Classical Age, or it has also one more name, Pseudo Classical Age. Why is it called New Classic Augustan Age and Pseudo Classical Age? I have already mentioned, and it is the age which covers the period from 1660 to 1780. And after 1780 or 85, we have a transitional period, and after that transitional period, we have romantic movement or romanticism. So if we talk about, if we summarize all this, what I've mentioned, so we can find easily that this is the age of reason. This is the age of this is the age in which you'll find no love for nature, or very rarely you'll find love for nature or love for common people or humanity, or you'll not find you know, subject matter more important than style. This is the age in which you will find intellectual efforts. You will find, observance of rules. You'll find restrictions. You'll find artificial use of artificial language, artificial life. City life more has been more focused, and no mention or very little mention of village life and natural things. In short, we can say. In short, we can say that the so-called rules are much more misunderstood and misinterpreted. As I told you, when we study the work of this age, we can find that the rules are much more misunderstood and misinterpreted in this particular age. So, in short, the so-called rules are much misunderstood and misinterpreted. In the classical poetry, means the poetry of this particular era, a harmonious balance was maintained between poetic expression and poetic substance. In the poetry of this age, too much attention is given to expression at the cost of substance. The age, therefore, is not really classical and is rightly called pseudo classical or new classical. So, this is what we have about this particular age. I hope students must have understood what I wanted to convey to them. If you have any problem regarding this, you can ask me. I'm waiting for your queries. So, this is the point which you should remember, that this is the age of satire. And satire was written both in the form of poetry and prose. And of course, in the form of poetry, you can find the big name of satirists like Alexander Pope, and in the form of prose, you'll find another big name, and that is the name of Jonathan Swift. So they both were writing satire, but one was writing in the form of poetry, and the second one was writing in the form of prose. Another big thing that you should remember is they were using only one meter, and that meter was heroic couplet. it means that they were satisfied with what they had. They were not having anything new. They were not experimenting any other meter. So they were using only heroic couplet, and that heroic couplet was uh, the only meter which they had. There might be some other writers. They might have been using some other meters, but overall, when we study, so we find that they were confined to rules, certain rules, and they were using only 1 meter. And this is again a very important thing to remember about this age, that their works reflect philosophical, you'll find reflection and philosophical comment comment on men in life. Philosophical comment, difficult to understand. So they are moralizing, means when they moralize, or they when they give lesson of moral lesson, so it is also much superficial and lacks completely in depth and originality. You'll not find originality in their moral lesson. The poet moralize on life, but they rarely have anything new or significant to say. Why? Because they were confined to rules. When they were confined to rules, so of course they had nothing new to say, or they had very rarely anything new to say. ये भी एक अहम पॉइंट है जिसको आपने जहन में रखना होगा. याद रखिएगा, when we study any work of literature, especially in literary criticism and theory, we must study the work, the life of the writer, about his principle, about his works, and we must study his age. If we don't study the age and the life and works and age especially, it will be difficult for us to understand his work, and that is why we must remember, or we must study his age, so that we can study, or we can analyze his work in the light of his age, and we can understand what the writer wants to say, or what the writer wanted to say through this or through his work. Observance of rules, जिसको मैं डिस्कस कर चुका हूँ, ये भी बहुत अहम चीज़ है. They were observing the rules and very strictly, and this is something that is rigidity, and this is something you will not find with the writers of other ages. You will find this will you will not find this is with romantic writers, with even Victorian writers. So there should not be fixed rules for anything. If we set certain rules, then definitely we will be confined to only those rules, and it will be difficult for any writer to bring, especially creativity, and to bring something very special. तो यही चीज़ें जो न्यू क्लासिकल राइटर के साथ हुई, वो समझे थे कि वो वाकई क्लासिकल राइटर्स को फॉलो कर रहे हैं और उनको कॉपी कर रहे हैं. But in fact, there was nothing like this. They were miscopying classical writers. They were miscopying them, and they confined themselves to rules and regulations very strictly. The imitation of the ancients became a kind of general rule for them, and this is where you know they had serious problems. They tried, they tried to write according to certain rules, and which were supposed to have been laid down by the ancients, and they looked down upon the great English poets with indifference and even with contempt. So dear students, if you have any problem regarding this, मैंने थोड़ा सा इसको रिवाइज भी कर दिया, और मुझे उम्मीद है, I hope now you will not have any problem. And if even if you have any problems, you can ask me, and inshallah I will try to satisfy you. With this I end this session. अगर इसके अलावा किसी को कोई प्रॉब्लम हो तो काइंडली वो मुझसे इस हवाले से पूछ सकता है. थैंक यू वेरी मच.